beautiful night. Thank you for coming to this author reading and event. Before we get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the territory on which we're gathered today as the homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and of Nunatukavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation together. This is something that we do at events, if you're not familiar with them, with Memorial University. It's called a land acknowledgement, and we use that as a kind of a way of ceremonially opening our events, as well as, of course, acknowledging the Indigenous history and inhabitants and contemporary inhabitants of the province. My name is Arn Keeling. I'm a geographer at Memorial University, and I'm super excited and pleased to host and MC this event. You won't hear much from me after this, and so you'll be pleased about that as well. Before we get started, what I'll do is I'll introduce the panelists, but before we do that, I'd like to thank the Nexus Center, one of the sponsors of this event. The Nexus Center is an interdisciplinary humanities and social science research and teaching hub at Memorial University, which is really active in promoting events like this one. And its director, Isabel Cote, is here, who helped us out with the organization. And thank you very much, Isabel. As well as her sound man sidekick, Stefan. Thank you, Stefan, who's floating around checking the sound for us right now. And of course, Kitty Vitty Brewery in this beautiful tap room for hosting us here at this event tonight. It's a little bit, if we all seem a little bit extra awkward, it's not because we're extra academic and extra nerdy tonight, but the fact is that we haven't been doing this for 18 months, right? I would say, for those affiliated with the university, how many talks have you been to since March 2020? This is my first. So we're also a little bit extra excited about that, and so extra nerding out about it. So we'll try and control ourselves, but you never know. There could be some spontaneous whoops and other sorts of excitement. Probably a lot of comments, as many as questions. So that's a little academic inside joke.
That's a joke. You wouldn't know it.
All right, so I am super excited to introduce our panelists for this author reading and book launch for this incredible book, which you cannot see, although I see another physical copy is in the room. That's very exciting because it's not yet available in Canada except electronically. It's The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey by the author, Dr. Julia Laite. Julia did her undergraduate in history at Memorial University before going on to a PhD from the University of Cambridge. You might have heard it. It's in the other London.
It's another joke.
Near the other London, I mean. She's now a reader in modern history and director of the Raphael Samuel History Center at Birkbeck, University of London. She researches and teaches on the history of women, crime, sexuality, and migration in the 19th and 20th centuries. And is the author of Common Prostitutes and Ordinary Citizens, Commercial Sex in London from 2012, and with Samantha Caslin, Wolfenden's Women, a Critical Source Book from last year. Her latest book, which you see before you, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, A True Story of Sex, Crime, and the Meaning of Justice, was published with Profile Books in April 2021 and still receiving rave reviews worldwide. You'll be hearing a selection from that book shortly. Next to Julia, and who will be off the first of our two commentators this evening, is Dr. Sonja Boon, who is a professor of gender studies at Memorial and the author of the critically acclaimed memoir, What the Oceans Remember, Searching for Belonging and Home, which is out on Wilfrid Laurier Press in 2019. She has a very specific interest in life writing and autoethnography. That is, she says, how we tell and understand our life stories across a wide range of historical and contemporary topics. And next to Sonja is Dr. Neil Kennedy, who is a historian at Memorial University, a specialist in 17th century Bermuda and the Caribbean, with a particular interest in credit, gender, and reputation in the English Atlantic, and with illicit trade in the Caribbean. He's also engaged in projects exploring remigration, unfree mariners, the Atlantic salt trade, and shipbuilding and inshore fishing in early Bermuda, topics of great interest to Newfoundlanders as well. So what we'll do now is I'm going to turn the microphone over to Julia, who will offer a reading and some commentary on the project that led to this book. Then Sonja and Neil will offer their comments, and we'll perhaps have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll invite some questions from you folks if you do have any. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Julia.
Thank you very much, Arn. Can everyone hear me okay? Grand. So first of all, it's so lovely to be here because, like Arn said, we've all gone so long without doing any in-person events, and I haven't gotten to do any in-person events for my book. So I've done lots of Zoom events, and it's been wonderful, but nothing quite replicates being in a room with people. So thank you, people, for being in the room with me. And thank you so much to Arn Keeling for helping me organize, not even helping me, for organizing it, and to the Nexus Center for supporting it, and of course to Sonja and Neil for their comments. I'm thanking you in advance. So unfortunately, like Arn said, there's actually no physical books for sale here. I was hoping there would be, but to cut a long story short, I'm just going to blame Brexit because it really ought to be blamed for most things. They're on the way, but they're not here now. But we do have these cards where you can scan a QR code and get it on Kindle edition, or if you want a hard copy, you can get it for free shipping on the other one on bookdepository.com. As my grandfather would say, the worst thing to have at a book event is not a book. But, oh well. So, what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to read a little bit from the book, a sort of first few pages and then kind of spliced a few other pages, and then reflect a little bit about why I wrote the book and how I wrote the book. And I hopefully won't keep you any longer than 30 minutes or so before I turn over to hear Sonja and Neil's commentary. So, in January of 1910, just a few months shy of her 17th birthday, Lydia Harvey disappeared. She bade farewell to the motley crew at Mrs. Logan's boarding house in downtown Wellington, New Zealand, where young men and women, new arrivals to the city, took their meals together in a threadbare dining room after a long day of work. She wrote to her mother, who had her hands full of children back home in the small provincial town of Oamaru, telling her that she had taken a job as a nursemaid to a rich couple who were bringing her with them to London. She gave notice to Mr. Harlow at the photography studio where she had recently gotten a job, where families with nice clothes and lines of orderly children came to buy Kodak cameras and develop pictures of their travels. Then she boarded a brand new steamship with 500 third-class berths and a triple expansion steam engine, which could cut through the waves of the Pacific and land her in Buenos Aires in less than a month's time. Then she seemed to disappear. A working-class provincial girl like Lydia was meant to be a respectable servant in the home of a wealthier woman, scrubbing, cooking, and caring for children for well over 70 hours each week. This was, in fact, why she had first come to the big city, joining a small army of young women who left rural and provincial towns the world over, traveling sometimes 10 and sometimes 10,000 miles on trains, roads, and steamships to answer the hungry call of the urban middle classes for live-in domestic servants. For more than a century, this had been the natural order of things. Working-class young women were essential fixtures in middle and upper-class households, without whom the wealthy would have to scrub and cook and care for themselves. But as the 20th century dawned, this system was in crisis, and the demand for servants far outstripped the supply. More and more young women were expressing their opinions on domestic service with their feet. Like many others, Lydia was desperate to pull herself out of this low-paid, low-status job, and seizing one of the growing opportunities for young women in shop work, she had landed herself a post at a photographer's studio. It was a move up, but she still wore plain cotton and unfashionable hats, and her purse was empty by the end of each month. A new world of travel, luxury, and consumer goods lay just beyond her grasp. She had seen the nice dresses and the fine shoes in the windows of shops and in the tissue-thin pages of catalogs. She had held the cameras and the travel photographs. Each morning, as her commuter train snaked its way to Mr. Harlow's photography studio, she saw the steamships at anchor in Wellington's wide blue harbor, waiting to carry people to Sydney, London, New York. As she returned home, she walked among the young women who smoked cigarettes and danced the night away, who kissed young men in corners, who had begun to claim the dangerous, exciting spaces of the city as their own. So when she met a beautiful woman named Marie Vernon and a handsome man called Aldo Cellis, who said they would give her nice dresses and help her to travel, she made the wager of a lifetime. 3 weeks later, a once unaffordable steamship ticket to Argentina was in her hands. Lydia was one of almost 3 million migrants who arrived in Buenos Aires' Puerto Madero in the years between 1887 and 1911. This was Argentina's golden age, a period of economic and population boom, fueled by foreign investment in transport, agriculture, and industry, and by territorial and imperial expansion. All over Latin America, in fact, the labor market had expanded rapidly. Immigrants, especially Spanish, Italian, and Eastern European Jews, flooded into the cities and towns. In Panama, the boat trains carried passengers, soldiers, and sailors from one ocean to the other, while the nearly completed canal project attracted thousands of single male laborers. In Argentina, the violent seizure of indigenous land by the state had opened up Las Pampas, the fertile grasslands of the interior, to a new style of ranching and farming that hungered for seasonal male labor at exactly the same time that advances in refrigeration on steamships meant that fresh Argentinian beef and pork could reach the meat markets of Europe and the Pacific. With this huge rise in migrant male labor and globally circulating people and goods, it's no surprise that the commercial sex market was also booming. Buenos Aires was one of the epicenters of this global intersection of labor, entertainment, and sex. The Argentine capital had been famous for its association with open prostitution since at least the 1870s. And amid perennial debates about the best way to manage this boom in commercial sex, venereal disease, and criminality, the city had by the late 1880s become home to one of the most infamous regulated prostitution systems in the world. It is unlikely that 17-year-old Lydia knew any of this, but she must have known upon arrival that she was far from home. As she joined the crowds on the steamship's deck, she could see an enormous metropolis, a city that could eat Wellington like a whale would eat a herring, stretching out from the crowded port at the end of a muddy estuary. She thought the ship was going to run headlong into another. There were more vessels here than she had ever seen, ships moored to other ships, stacked 2 or 3 deep along the wharf, the smoke from their coal engines spewing into great clouds, the masts of the smaller sailing vessels tangled together in the sky. She must have alighted in the crowd with her stomach turning in waves of excitement and dread. But when the handsome man and beautiful woman met her beneath the Buenos Aires sun, their masks began to slip. She was taken out into the shining, pulsing city to buy nice dresses. A woman came to their apartment and bleached her hair blonde. She was shown how to put on makeup. Then she was forced to sell sex to old and disgusting men in the city's notorious Teatro Casino, where she contracted a sexually transmitted infection and, after a police raid on their illegal brothel, was dragged to London, locked all the while in the stateroom of a steamship. 6 harrowing months later, Lydia was finally found in London by Metropolitan Police detectives, shivering in a hand-me-down dress and trying to catch the eye of passing men under the electric lights of Piccadilly Circus. They brought her back to Great Marlborough Street Police Station, and here she told her story, or at least the parts the police wanted to hear and the parts she elected to reveal. Lydia's story, however it was told, unfolded in an era that was obsessed with the idea of the exploited prostitution of young white women. The public was hungry to read such melodramatic, sexualized stories of innocence and ruin, and books with titles like From Dance Hall to White Slavery and The Girl Who Disappeared became early 20th century bestsellers. To the authors of cheap novels and newspaper exposés, Lydia Harvey was another bit of fodder for a salacious plot or an eye-catching headline. To those who campaigned for better laws and policies to rescue and reform trafficking victims, Lydia Harvey was a morality tale. In the eyes of moralizers and sensationalizers alike, she was a girl. That is, an unmarried, working-class young woman who was dangerously untethered and unformed. Girls like Lydia were in need of protection and control in order to prevent them being lost to the twilight world of vice and prostitution, in order to save them from themselves. Inside the stories other people told about her, the real Lydia Harvey disappeared again and again. She was no one. Who she was, what she wanted, what happened afterwards, none of this mattered. She joined a legion of missing girls whose brief appearances in newspapers and books remained uncomplicated by their past experiences of poverty, abuse, or their exploitation in other kinds of work. No one took any notice of their dreams, ambitions, and desires. In the hands of newspaper reporters and rescue workers, stories like Lydia's served as cautionary tales for any young working-class woman who longed for adventure and travel, for better pay or better working conditions, and, if they dared to imagine it, for a life of luxury and romance. The end of the story was always an imagined punishment for the girls who had, in the parlance of the time, been ruined. The girls who didn't know their place. Her slavery lasts some 5 or 6 years as a rule, noted one dramatic writer. And then she is flung out upon the streets, her character gone, her hope dead, her body diseased, to die before long, either in a workhouse or a lock hospital. The missing girls in these ubiquitous stories were condemned to a short life of misery, disease, and degradation. They vanished forever beneath the slime of the underworld and remained literally nameless and unknown. So, I first encountered Lydia Harvey the way that most historians encounter any nobody from the past, filtered, dislocated, and preserved in the imperfect amber of an archive file, MIPO 3/197 to be exact, which I found in the National Archives in the United Kingdom. It was 2008, and she was caught up in my hungry search for all the case files I could find about trafficking as I prepared the manuscript for my first book, Common Prostitutes and Ordinary Citizens. And in the end, I used a very short anecdote about Lydia Harvey and her traffickers to frame one of the book's chapters, and to illustrate my arguments about how anti-trafficking law was applied badly in the UK in the early 20th century, and how it largely turned into a crusade against undesirable immigration. Throughout the book, other women like Lydia Harvey appeared and then disappeared in similar ways. Here as an example that proved a rule, there as an exception to a trend. And I did this, and most social and cultural historians do similar things, in part because I believed that there was little more I could discover about these women, that I had caught a glimpse of a marginalized person who was caught like a fly, as Jean-Paul Gabriel puts it, between the pages of a larger archive. I had assumed that Lydia had disappeared from history when the detective inspector in charge of her case relayed the news of her repatriation in his final report, placed it in the thick file, and closed the cover. In her book, Imperfect Histories, Anne Rigney notes the importance of anecdotes in communicating the unknowability of the past, especially when discussing the vast majority of people who have left few or no documents behind. These people, as Rigney points out, can only incidentally be revealed in a negative way by anecdotes, in which the normally hidden routine is for some reason disrupted and hence recorded. The glimpse becomes a methodological principle, she writes. And it was Lydia's moment of duress, her arrest and the subsequent police interrogation, that made her visible to me, that made her slightly less nameless and unknown. And our ability to discover anything at all about the obscure, humble, and marginalized people in the past inspires fascination. As John Arnold writes, there's little more seductive in social history than the promise of access to the voices of those normally absent from the historical record. But this fascination exists in productive tension with our inability to discover everything about them. About Minocchio, we know many things, Carl Gisberg writes in that famous work of microhistory, The Cheese and the Worms. About this Marcato or Marco, and so many others like him who lived and died without leaving a trace, we know nothing. So this, argues Anne Rigney, is where history meets the sublime, where historians concede and accept the limitations on their ability to know, comprehend, and represent a boundless past. But what happens now in this age of digitization, especially this age of digitized family history records, when actually our ability to chase people out of this bounded archive, follow them and use character searching to trace them around the world has become so much greater, so much faster, and so much finer grained. And this book, in part, is an experiment in trying to answer that question. I thought, what would happen if I chased Lydia Harvey off the archives page, if I tried to find her beginning, and if I tried to find her end? How could I mobilize this new wealth of digitized, character-searchable historical records, mostly created by the family history industry, to enable this new approach? And so, to use a very technical methodological term, I started poking around. And then I started finding stuff. And then I started finding more stuff. And I kept poking around and poking around and poking around. And 5 years later, I wrote a book. So I got very, very obsessed with Lydia Harvey and everybody that she was connected to. My first re-encounter, so that first moment when I found her outside of the context I had initially thought she was forever trapped in, I saw her on an actual sorry, is that buzzing? No. Okay, it was buzzing for me. I didn't want to deafen anyone. I saw her on a stage in a tiny column in the Oamaru Mail, located by careful character searching. There she was, the girl I thought I could know nothing more about, winning a silver bracelet as the runner-up in a beauty contest at the town's brand new opera house in 1909. From there, from that one glimpse, that was enough. I was obsessed then. From there, I collated hundreds more glimpses, found new archive files through focused searches and sometimes by sheer serendipity. I pieced these together with genealogical data, immigration records, steamship manifests. And in the end, I was able to trace Lydia's journey, as well as the journeys of other people in the book, from Oamaru to Wellington to Buenos Aires to London to Italy and beyond. And I used novels, short stories, and local histories to illuminate the texture of where she lived and how she worked. And I also went physically to as many places as I could, very happily. The book wasn't finished before COVID, but the research was finished before COVID. So I was actually able to go to New Zealand and Australia and walk the same streets and look for the houses that she lived in, using old photographs and maps laid like a palimpsest upon new streets and buildings. I finally discovered the truth about her family, about where she had come from, which had been a mystery for about 2 years, in the partially preserved magistrates' courts records for Oamaru. Scribbled on the page, her mother's name, taking Harry G.C. Harvey, a local solicitor and the son of a very wealthy district judge, to court for non-payment of a child maintenance order. And thanks to Chris Mitchum at the Waitaki District Archive in Otago, I even found a photograph of Lydia Harvey. But this photograph encapsulates the sublime pain of all I still cannot know about her, because it's a school photograph, and I know that she's in it, but I don't know which girl she is. So I have stared at that photograph forever, and I'll be damned if she has not spoken it. I later learned that Lydia did well enough in school, but did not distinguish herself as a scholar. As the oldest child in a family of 7 fatherless daughters, there were likely more pressing things to do than study. And then, in 1909, when she was 16, she had just won this beauty contest and just finished her schooling, her mother felt the familiar flutter in her belly once again. In May that year, there would be twins. Lydia was the eldest of what were now 7 daughters, and a set of twins meant that she would practically be the mother of at least one. More nappies to boil and peg out on the line, more pots to scour, more mouths to feed, more bodies crowded into her bed. She loved her sisters, but if she stayed, she would surely disappear. And so she dreamed. She set out on her own. She made use of the new and cheaper technologies of transportation and communication, and like hundreds of thousands of other young women, she left the safety of her home and dreamt of better. This was her mobile world, and I did my best to travel it on her terms. But her terms of engagement with this world were limited. She was the eldest bastard child of 9 bastard children, and her father was of some use to her in the form of those slowly extracted child payments when he was alive, but he was of no use to her at all when he dropped dead from a heart attack in his 32-room mansion in Christchurch in 1909. His estate made no mention of a child. The maintenance payments dried up, the twins were born, and Lydia Harvey did what hundreds of thousands of other girls did. She left home and she went into domestic service. where she worked alone in a suburban house for over 75 hours a week and scrounged the life of a teenage girl for herself for 7 hours on Sundays. In fact, in that same year, 1909, the New Zealand Servants' Union was formed. Their key demand? A 68-hour work week. That was the union's demand. The union was disbanded by the government before this demand was met, and it remains unmet in global labor standards right up into the present day. From 120 years' distance, Lydia Harvey tells us that it's useless to consider women's exploitation and prostitution without also considering their exploitation in other forms of work. She also tells us that desire is at least as important as desperation when poor girls make difficult decisions about their lives. She met the people she knew as Aldo Cellis and Marie Vernon one night after work when she was introduced by a fellow lodger. "You'll have nice dresses and not want for anything and be quite happy," they promised her. "If you do as I do and see gentlemen," Marie added. With pennies in her purse and stars in her eyes, she agreed. "I always wanted to travel," she said later, from a seat beside the fire in a Metropolitan Police Inspector's room in London's Soho. Unknowns are a fundamental part of any history, especially histories of nobody girls like Lydia Harvey. I chased her around the world, quite literally, but ultimately I never was left with enough to narrate an entire story from her point of view. And so I began to wonder how the case might be further illuminated by applying the same technique to the people who she encountered along the way. The man and the woman who trafficked her, the police who prosecuted the case, the journalist who broke the story, and the social worker who ran the safe house in which Lydia stayed while awaiting trial. And so the book became a polyvocal history, or a history in the round, as I've also called it, so where every chapter looks at the story from a slightly different point of view. And it turns out the man Lydia knew as Aldo Cellis had quite the story of his own. It took me a while to find him. He was adept at self-reinvention, and to this day, I'm not sure I found all his pseudonyms. But I do know that he was born Antonio Adolfo Carvelli in Turin in 1879, an ideal modern boy. He was the son of a maestro de musica and was classically trained in opera. He spoke 6 languages and spent some time in the military in the officer class. But he too had desires that his life could not accommodate. A major theft saw him flee Italy in 1901 and reinvent himself in Australia, first as an opera singer, then as a hotel barber, which is somebody who pretends to be a guest at fancy hotels, watches the guests' leaves, and then goes upstairs and gets into their room. Then later, once he was caught, went to prison and got back out, we find him as a colorful entrepreneur in Australia's Wild West, and then finally as a pimp in the Western Australian goldfields. He profited immensely. His suits were tailored, his fingers were heavy with gold. It was here that he met his wife, who called herself Vonda back then. She had come to the Wild West to mine the miners, selling sex to the mostly Italian mine workers in Australia's deepest gold mine, owned by the magnate and later American president, Herbert Hoover. Vonda was also called Marie Vernon, but her real name was Veronique White. She was not, as one might expect, a poor woman who fell into sex work out of desperation. She was middle class, beloved by her family, well-connected and self-assured. She also demonstrates how easy it was to slip out of the view of authorities and historians. She escaped back to New Zealand before the trial and was referred to in court simply as a woman unknown. I tracked her down at long last, but she remains inscrutable. Her story reveals another facet of sexual labor in this age of consumption and globalization, and the complexities of a woman who occupied the uncomfortable position of both victim and perpetrator of abuse and exploitation. And it was these precise complexities that caused the police so much trouble in their attempt to investigate and prosecute Lydia Harvey's case. Metropolitan Police Detective Inspector Ernest Anderson, so far as I can tell, did his absolute best to bring Antonio Carvelli to justice, and I learned how, where, and when she died. but I won't tell you that part. Instead, I'll tell you why I wrote this book very briefly and what I hope it has achieved. How much longer do I have, Arn? 5 minutes. Perfect. Firstly, because we desperately need new stories about sexual labor, trafficking, and exploitation. We continue to live today within many of the legal and ideological parameters set by the early 20th century anti-trafficking movement, where the idea of anti-trafficking as anti-immigration and of rescue as incarceration and punishment predominates. Dichotomies of victim and criminal continue to simplify and efface human and structural complexity. Just as they were in the early 20th century, 21st century newspaper columns are filled with stories of young women who disappear from their home countries and are found in brothels, farmers' fields, and nail bars. We traffic in these stories, and we call them awareness campaigns. Ultimately, we're uninterested in trafficking victims as human beings who make complex choices within systems of global inequality that we are doing little to mitigate. We care little about where they came from, why they left home, and still less about what happens to them afterwards. As Carol Vance puts it, these stories entertain and absolve us. We need new stories, more complex and uncomfortable stories where victims can also be perpetrators, where carceral anti-migrant solutions backfire and put power into the hands of corrupt state and corporate actors, as well as the traffickers themselves, where women are making terribly difficult decisions, where well-meaning systems fail them again and again, and where we reflect critically on our own role in perpetuating the exploitation that makes trafficking possible. But we also need stories. As in, I passionately believe in storytelling as a form of scholarship and as a way of communicating scholarship to others. I draw immense inspiration from scholars like Saidiya Hartman and Marissa Fuentes, who have found beautiful experimental ways to retell the histories of young Black women who have been almost erased by their extreme marginalization and exploitation. I'm also trying to challenge the way that historians anecdotalize humble and obscure people in social history. This book began to take shape when I got really interested in what would happen if I turned a brief case study, an illustrative anecdote, into a full story. And not just a grain of sand through which we can see some bigger theme, but as an important story in its own right. Not only did this turn out to be possible, but it was also productive. It illuminated a nexus of work, migration, exploitation, and experience that I could never have dealt with so holistically had I taken a different tack. And I am, of course, a rescue worker in this story. I've saved Lydia Harvey from the condescension of posterity, but like rescue workers in her own life, I never asked if she wanted to be saved. And I remain skeptical about the idea of restorative justice for the dead and gone, but I have no doubts about the power of historical storytelling to change minds and hearts and to advocate for justice in the present. So that's why I tried to find Lydia Harvey, to prove that I could, to prove that it matters, and to signal all the other stories that also matter, which have unfolded in the past and continue to be lived today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your book, and also for speaking about it so eloquently tonight. It was really great to hear a little bit more about the genesis of it and so on. I met Julia first in 2017 when we were at a conference. I was telling these guys too about when we were at a conference that took place at Bristol Zoo. It was on creative histories, and so our talks were accompanied by the sound of flamingos, and we actually had to shut the windows at a certain point because the flamingos were getting rowdy.
This time it was interrupted by my son, so that's very
There you go. And one of the things that about that conference was it was really about how do we tell histories in different sorts of ways rather than in just quote unquote typically conventionally scholarly ways. And that was certainly, because I met Julia there and because I know that was part of her project here, that was one of the ways that I read this particular book, is I was really interested in how it was that she brought this to life. And all the way through, I was also wondering, what would this have looked like as a conventional scholarly book? And so that's a question I will put to you to answer at some point, because I'm really curious, how that might have looked, how it would feel different, what different kinds of stories it would tell, what would it leave behind. Because what struck me about reading this particular book was that when we hear stories, and I think Julia's pointed to this already, when we often hear stories of trafficking, we hear them in very sorts of anonymous and anonymized sorts of ways, often with big numbers, with countries, and it's hard to bring them to life. And one of the things that this very micro sort of approach does is that it makes it possible for us to see the nuances and the complexities and the contradictions at play, because lives are messy. They don't just fit into black, they don't just fit into white, they fit into all this other stuff in between. And sometimes you want someone to fit into this category and they push themselves out of it. And they're suddenly looking at it from another perspective. And I think that that is one of the things that I don't want to say enjoyed, because it's not a fun read to read about trafficking and in various sorts of ways. But it is what I really appreciate about this book, was that it got at complexity. It got at the messiness and how it is that people make decisions in difficult situations. And some of those, and why they make those decisions and where those decisions lead them and what they do about it in the process. And that really, I think that messiness, it's not written in a messy way in any way, shape, or form, but it gets at the messiness of life and the messiness of living when your choices are circumscribed. The other thing I really appreciated about this book was the ways that archives can be mobilized to find people who generally are meant to disappear in archives, right? So archives generally favor the privileged. They favor people who have lots of money, lots of education, are able to have things saved for them, are able to write things for themselves. They don't favor Lydia Harveys of the world at all in any way, shape, or form. And often when we find them in court documents and police records. And those are, while those are great places to start, they're also inevitably compromised spaces, because they're the people, when they talk when their voices are recorded there, they're under duress. They're worried about imprisonment. They're worried about all sorts of things. And so they're very compromised spaces. And so then to think that, is that the only space? To then say, okay, what comes out beyond that? Can we actually use archives in a different way to find the story of one person who shouldn't actually exist in an archival space? Which I think was quite wonderful here to see how much. Sure, you say you didn't get at who she was, and there's so much we can never know, but look at how much you did find, which was really amazing. Like the level of detail, I was like, I don't know, where is that? I wanted to go on these archival trips too, and not just because Australia and New Zealand are cool places to visit, because I love living in archives myself and hanging out in them. And so to me, that was one of the brilliant parts too, because it was about what actually, if we look perhaps differently through archival records, what can we find that perhaps we weren't looking out for? Because in this case, you were also looking for people who had aliases of various sorts. So that adds to the adventure of archival research in quite complicated sorts of ways. I was also thinking, what else I hear here too? I have to say that I went down through your acknowledgements, because I love reading acknowledgements. I don't know about how you are, but I love reading acknowledgements because it's quite wonderful. And when I was reading this, I was thinking also of how Saidiya Hartman in Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which if you have not read that book, there's another fantastic book to read. How she takes up also these kinds of like police records, social work records, and so on, to tell different stories about young Black women, to not just see them as wayward and disorderly, but to see them making lives for themselves, actively making lives for themselves in complicated ways. And I think that's one of the things that Julia does in this book too, which is to say, what kind of life was Lydia thrust into, but what like in life did she make for herself as well? That there is a push and pull and a tension at play there. The final thing I want to say is that the other thing that this made me think of is the work of Ruth Singer. And I don't remember Ruth Singer. She was at the Creative History. She is actually a visual artist, a textile artist, who did she's based in the UK, so you can have a nice project with her, where she created a criminal quilts project where she looked at photographs of criminalized individuals, and she created textile works in relation to them from the late 19th century. So I would love to see an intersection between your work and her work. So that's the last thing I want to say. Thank you so much for writing the book.
Thank you, Sonja. And of course, thank you, Dr. Lake, for this marvelous book. And I had just read Hartman's Wayward Lives just before Arne gave me the copy of your book. And it was very much, I would repeat that comment, very much in mind as you're thinking about that, the different meanings of that word, wayward. Okay, so I'm going to read because I'm rusty, as Arne began saying it. But again, I would say, yes, to thank you. This is some books feel like they're compelled themselves into existence. The stories that demand to be told, and this really feels like one of those. Right? It really has a compulsion. This is a book full of extraordinary connections, astounding archival research, as Sonja just said, really extraordinary amounts of research, and revealing links. A book that thoughtfully explores the multiple meanings of ideas and words like disappearance, spectacle, waywardness. Central to the book are the ways marginalized members of society sought and seek to determine their own lives. For some of the women encountered here, intimate bonds between marginalized people shaped their lives in significant and distinct ways. Other women used intimacy and kinship to construct and enact their freedom. For some, exercising liberty came to require figurative and literal contact between their bodies and empire. At the heart of the book is a reckoning with a moral panic, a panic about so-called white slavery and sexual trafficking, framed as historically particular to this period, but also timeless in many ways, and we've just heard a bit more about that. Like other instances, this was moral panic more often about the hammer than the helping hand, a panic that redirected moral debate away from the problem of societal complicity, away from deep structural inequalities, and tried to narrowly frame public morality as solely concerned with sex. Beware the men who vow to protect your purity, indeed. There's a whole fascinating side here, too, about the role of the sensationalist press and about the professionalization of policing and public health in shaping the ways that this moral panic played out, orienting and delimiting the liberty of some people. There's a lesson here about who gets called a victim, who does not, and the space in between those two things. One of the occupational hazards for the historian faced with such an abundance of evidence as this is that the archive can overdetermine the story. I think that is, the evidence, the missing pieces, the silences can both structure and limit and can foreclose other ways of seeing the past. I think one of the things I really valued in this book is that Julia's book shows us ways out of that hazard of overdetermination. One, by drawing the evidence outwards, always into that larger context which gives the evidence its meaning. Secondly, by working to understand human actors in their own terms, revisiting the archive from multiple perspectives. And thirdly, by placing that story in conversation with the present. Public narratives about violence, like that suffered by Lydia Harvey in 1910, are more politically powerful than we sometimes credit, but powerful not always in the ways we might hope. One of the many things making this book so compelling, I think, is its attentiveness to our responsibility to our human subjects and to their dignity, and vigilance in anticipating how our narratives might be used to harm further. By carefully and closely reading the police files and government records, Dr. Laite exposes the early development of what historians are now coming to call forensic cultures, the medical, legal, juridical, psychiatric practices embedded in particular cultural and political contexts, which have become foundational to the carceral cultures in which we now live. Those forensic cultures are often seen as developing a little bit later than this period, but this book's fascinating case study illuminates an early form of these investigative processes and institutions which enacted the gendered and classist and inevitably racialized dimensions of state power. Legal historians like Rebecca Scott have shown how passage across water might, in certain circumstances, have a selective, solvent effect on human rights, diluting the strength of once palpable liberties. The warmer the waters, the more powerful the dilution, it seems. Julia's book shows how early forensic cultures harness new technologies of communication and administration to reach across the water and exercise power in much more immediate ways than had been possible before, following both Lydia Harvey and her tormentors in sometimes unexpected ways. It is these global threads that draw this story together and give it such power. But the global was also at the same time pulling apart this world in interesting ways. Nation states tried to assert themselves as domestic spaces, that is, geographically coherent, legally bounded economies and societies. But these were already irrevocably global and permeable spaces. And so the second half of the book turns to themes of deportation, anti-immigrant nativism, and repatriation, themes that seem all too current today. There are other threads of a global story about sexual regulation and nativism that could be added in here, I think. In 1909, the year before the main events in London reckoned with in this book, the US federal government expanded the Comstock anti-vice laws of 1873. These are the famous anti-obscenity laws that never actually define obscenity. They banned the distribution of contraceptives, sex education, and medical materials, and they absolutely made ordinary women's lives objectively harder. But women in the US fought those laws in various ways too, asserting civil liberties and valuing privacy and bodily autonomy in the same measure Lydia Harvey was doing in London. These women might find in the courtroom and the back room, the printing press, and even in the popular seances of the period, the means of claiming the authority to speak in a world that too often denied them that. Finally, I found this book really speaks to my own field, the study of slavery and resistance, in the way it frames acts of resistance. Far too long, historians mostly understood resistance as individualized and individualistic acts, understood in terms that were largely about Western liberalism and too often about masculinity. But historically, resistance was more often practiced and understood as a collective act. One embodied in social relations. More often than not, it was fundamentally a social act, as suggested here by the relationship between Lydia Harvey and Aileen MacDonald of the Metropolitan Police, the woman who encouraged and supported Harvey's testimony against her villains and protected her privacy. In that social cooperation and connection, there is a potent lesson for our world. As this book so ably shows, we are unable to look back at this period as impartial observers outside and above empire. We live in its still warm remains. So thank you very much, Julia.
Thank you very much, Julia, and to our commentators for your illuminating comments on the book. I think we'll kind of roll into a fairly free-flowing Q&A session. That will maybe I'll have you guys put your thinking caps on if you have a specific question if you want to ask Julia first. But I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask a question that's kind of a methodological one, and I know you've answered it before because I saw you on a podcast thing or something. But it's about the way the book is written. It's an extremely novelistic book. If you haven't gotten this already, it's a page turner, right? This is not a book of academic history. And one of the things you do in here is you really evoke thought and emotion. So this is terra incognita, and in some cases, you're not supposed to be doing that as a historian, right? It could be suggested that you're embroidering your sources, et cetera. So perhaps you can tell me a little bit about the decisions you made when you were talking about Lydia Harvey or the other very interesting characters' thoughts, feelings, reactions, and even particular daily contexts, and how you reconstructed this, gave yourself creative license, but tried to stay true to the story as well.
Yes, I could. There's a fly. Don't let it fall in the water. Okay. Okay. I could be accused of it, but I built in a kind of internal logic to how I wanted to do this, because I did have different versions of this story where I did imagine more concretely the interiority of Lydia Harvey or of Aldo Cellis or Antonio Cavelli, I should call him, but I kind of threw that out because it didn't feel right. And you'll notice in the book that I'm very, very, very careful when I start to imagine their interior worlds. And that's where I turn to words like must have, or may have, or should have, or probably. I'm always careful, and I very often signal a potential other way of reading it, right? So, say, did they feel like this, or did they feel like that? And I kind of, hopefully subtly and elegantly, inviting the readers to kind of think through that themselves. So instead of kind of saying this is the interior world of a young woman who I cannot possibly know the interior world of, I just make it plain that she had one. Because the alternative to ignoring that altogether is to kind of desertify the characters. And so I kind of left it up to the reader in some ways. I signaled, here's what the historical record may suggest, girls were feeling and doing and dreaming of at the time. We can assume that Lydia Harvey shared some of these characteristics. We can never know for sure. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. But I'm very, very, very careful, because I always had the person on my shoulder saying, you can't do that. It wasn't Arn. It wasn't Arn. It looked a little bit like Arn, though. But the other thing I really found myself focusing on was materiality. So in the absence of being able to get at the interiority, I thought much more deeply than I ever have before as a historian about the exteriority of their world. So I paid, in any photographs, I paid really close attention to what people were wearing. I contacted dress historians. I asked them what this meant to them. I ended up going down a major rabbit hole about a Nellie Stewart bangle, which was all the rage in 1910s Australia. It was like a love token that people would give you, a suitor would give a woman, and things that I never wrote that kind of history before. And the weather, yes, I checked every single scene I wrote. I checked the weather forecast, and what's really handy, because they have really shite weather forecasts, is that they actually. The newspapers wouldn't report what the weather the next day was going to be. They would report what the weather the day before had been. So you're really certain. It's not just sort of like it may have been raining. It's you go into so you want to write about a scene on the 9th of July 1910. You go to the 10th of July 1910, and it'll say yesterday's weather. And so when I describe scenes in the book where people are shivering in a hand-me-down dress, for example, it's because I know that was the coldest summer in London on record. And so I have lots of characters commenting on how bloody cold it is in London, especially the Australian characters who, aren't used to that kind of weather at all. So I did that, and it kind of, in some ways, relates to Sonja's provocation about, what would this look like as a more traditional book, and that's how I started writing it. That's certainly what I told the granting agency.
I know that's true.
And then, Lydia Harvey wouldn't let me go. I mean, that's how it started, really, is just getting really obsessed with this young woman and just thinking, how much could I find if I really, 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 really pushed it, if I really took it as far as I could. But it also, because, exactly as you said, because this is so messy, and it's extremely difficult to explain how messy it is to people who aren't familiar with the scholarship on trafficking, because we are inundated with very, very simplified stories of exploitation. And I came around to the fact that I think a story is the most complicated way to communicate anything. Story is, there was a reason why humans love stories above all else. It's because it is deceptively simple way to capture immense complexity in a way that academic prose could never do. And so I think it was always destined to be this book. And the AHRC did eventually forgive me for not writing the book I told them I was going to write.
Do either of you want to ask a question?
I have a question I can ask him. I'll also say that I have done the same thing with a grant application, and I wrote a memoir rather than a scholarly book, so there you go.
Excellent.
My question actually is about, you mentioned the work of family historians and the work of people digitizing local archives and so on. And so I guess my question is for all those people out there who think, wait a sec, maybe I can search out some stuff. How would I go about doing it? What would I look for? Where could I find it? Because I think it is a whole new world out there. How could I find the weather report for yesterday, right? Those kinds of things too, because it is hilarious reading the weather report for yesterday. But those kinds of things, it's just a practical question for people who might be interested in doing it themselves.
That's a great question, and one I'm super excited about, because my work now, I got so obsessed with family history that now my next project is going to be about family history. I think obviously you join Ancestry.com or Find My Past or Family Search, but I think most of all go on Twitter, where there are immensely helpful, generous communities of family historians and genealogists who helped me a great deal. So I'm very indebted, obviously, to the technologies of the family history industry in writing this book, but I'm more indebted to the family historians and local historians who helped me, right? So I've got apparently. I've been told I'm speaking at the Oamaru Local History Society in a couple of months' time, which is the town that Lydia Harvey was born in. Well, she was born in Dunedin, but then she moved to Oamaru. You don't need these details. And they are all collectively trying to identify her from the school photograph. So they're literally all working together and like triangulating who they know in the picture. And I can't find the picture. Oh, there it is. I just found it. Yeah, they're all going through that. You won't be able to see it. It's a gray square, or a group of young women and men, and they're all going through it, trying to find Lydia for me, so that I can finally know which young woman she is. And so, like, I would just say go for it. And what you'll find is an incredibly generous community of people who aren't just interested in like, oh, this person's on my family tree and they were a duke, but are getting more and more interested in, lateral connections, not just depth, breadth, and the way that we're all connected to each other, and the way that family history really challenges us to reconfigure how we narrate ourselves, how we narrate where we're from. There's no better example than Sonja's book, What the Oceans Remember. So that's the other thing you can do, is pick her book up and read it and think about how you might rethink your own family history along those lines. So yeah, thank you for that question. I'm super enthusiastic about it.
I think Neil had a question. Thank you. Maybe something quick then, so we can move to the audience. But I was wondering, you raised the question of what we owe the past and restorative justice. So I'm working on a book in which I don't know what happens to the last stage. So I wondered if you could just say briefly, or not, how would you feel if you didn't know the last stage of your life? Would you think differently?
I think I'd feel better because I wouldn't be as sad. Spoiler alert. I don't know. I don't know. Because when you're researching somebody who was born in 1893, you know they're going to be dead at the end of it, right? Like, there's no surprises there. There could be a surprise, and that would be a really big surprise. Zombie history, exactly. But you always know you're going to find their end. And I had this whole imagined end for her, like what would be perfect for the narrative I wanted to write. It's like, come on, Lydia, live the life I want you to live, so I can end my book the way I want to end it. She didn't do it that way. And in some ways, maybe it would have been better not to have known. So I could have sort of said, oh, maybe it was this, or maybe it was that. You decide. Choose your own adventure. Yeah, she actually disappears. Choose your own adventure, audience. If Lydia lived a long life and had 16 grandchildren, turn to page 372. But that's not the case. I found her. I found her grave. I stood by her grave. But I think ultimately that is better, that I did find her. But I think there would have been ways, had I not found her, to imagine what would have happened had I did or not. But yeah, in some ways I wish I hadn't. But you'll have to read the book to know why. There's some happy years in between, I think.
So at the risk of keeping us all here way later and with emptier glasses than we would prefer, yeah, lady needs a beer. So if anybody wants to help that, please feel free. Since you can't buy a book, buy a beer. How about that?
The ocean one?
Yeah, the ocean one, please. Oh, hang on, we got a servant right here. Look, that's perfect. Why don't we'll take maybe a couple of questions from folks in the audience if they have one that aren't direct blood relations of Julia. I'm told we're not allowed. So this is, okay. If you're not a direct blood relation, you're good to go. Okay.
She's not.
So, and then I'll try and repeat the question since we can't really have this.
I dealt with it by spending a year doing it. Yes, there were many other Lydia Harveys. There was a moment of insanity where I thought maybe I should just write a book about all of the Lydia Harveys. Yeah, and then the funder will be really confused about what it was they funded. But I did manage to narrow it down, because you just it can't be that, it can't be that person because they weren't born in the. I was lucky in that I didn't know her birth year, but I knew her sister's birth month for a very sad reason, because in her witness statement she talks about having gone through a very, very difficult moment in her experience of trafficking, and she says, "I remember it well because it was my sister's birthday." And so that gave me her sister's birthday. And so you just start eliminating from there. But her bastard father never registered her birth. So her birth certificate doesn't exist. that can only be because her father didn't register it, because it was actually mandatory at the time to register births in New Zealand. So it just took me a really, really long time. But I did also find myself going down all kinds of garden paths with other people in the story. So some of which I managed to weave in, like the winner of the beauty contest, whose name was Nellie Matthey. At one point, I just sort of said, it was 11 o'clock at night, and I was still on Ancestry, and I sort of went, I wonder what happened to Nellie Matthey. And that turned out to be a whole other story. And I think ultimately it goes back to something Sonja was saying, is that, people are so messy and unpredictable, and like historians really try quite hard to keep them under control. But the second you kind of let them lead the way and you just start following people, following Lydias and Nellies, you just get so surprised by what their stories really are. So yeah, I did it because just through taking a lot of time and eliminating things, but also I actually do have miniature histories of a bunch of other Lydia Harveys. Yeah.
At least it wasn't John Smith.
Yes, exactly.
Any other questions or comments or reactions from the crowd?
Julia,
Mm-hmm.
so we're saying the father didn't register Lydia Harvey. So did the mother identify the dad?
Yeah.
I'm curious. Like, usually the mom.
Yeah, exactly. So she's on all the other all of her other daughters, who all have beautiful names. That's the other answer to your question. Thank you. Her middle name is Rhoda, Lydia Rhoda Harvey, and I finally found the Rhoda part, and there is no other Lydia Rhoda Harvey, so that helped. But her mother put the mother's name and no father's name in all the other birth certificates. There are two that are missing, her and her sister Linda. Lydia and Linda. I'm not entirely convinced they weren't actually twins, but that 2 years later, I still can't prove it, so I left it out of the book. But I do know they had the same father, and I'm pretty sure she said, "Okay, now Harry, register the births," and he said, "I registered them," but he didn't. Yeah, and so I think that's why it's a bit weird. There's a bit of a weird thing, and I had to actually manually go through all of the magistrates' court's records, just on a whim. I also found her other sister, who had been charged with riding without bicycle lights. But yeah,
Another ruined woman.
another ruined woman, exactly. But yeah, that is a real mystery, and that I didn't solve until kind of the nth hour. And because in her marriage certificate, when Lydia gets married, which is a slight spoiler, but when Lydia gets married, she tells the minister in Sydney, Australia, that her father is a New Zealand Supreme Court judge. So I spent like 3 weeks in Cambridge Law Library going through every register of New Zealand legal professionals, trying to find somebody who could have been her father, to no avail. And what had happened, of course, is that she was either lying, or she had been lied to, or she just remembered it wrong, right? She just knew her father was some kind of judgy lawyer person. But it was her grandfather who was a district judge. But yeah, I think they actually actively covered up her birth, because he remarried and she never got a cent of the money when he died.
Another question for Julia? Everybody's after. One more, go. Thank you.
How did it feel when you got to the cemetery and you knew her headstone was there, and like say 2 minutes before you got to the headstone, what were you thinking? And then when you seen it, what happened to you?
2 minutes before I got to the headstone, I was thinking, holy shit, these are the largest mosquitoes I have ever seen. Why did I wear a strapless dress, or like a strappy dress? But when I got there, it's a headstone in the shape of a heart. There's no other headstone like it, as far as I could tell, in the cemetery. And I'd bought roses from a florist nearby, and I was overcome. I was very, very weepy, to tell you the truth. But it was just such a strange experience because there was nobody. It's a massive cemetery, is Sandgate. And there was nobody else around, just me and the mosquitoes on this very, very, very hot autumn day in Newcastle, in Australia, which is where she died. And all of the lead lettering had fallen out of her gravestone. So I sort of spent 20 minutes pushing her name back into the grave. And I always say, so one of the first sort of sites I went to in the book was Antonio Carvelli's boyhood home, which was an apartment in San Salvarino in Turin. And it was hilarious because I had brought my partner and our kids, or then one kid, and I was dragging them past the Risorgimento Museum and dragging them past the shroud, being like, no, this is the site we need to go see. A dead pimp's apartment. And, I was sitting there and I was like, what am I doing? Like, what is the point of this? Because this is very early days in the research. But, 4 years later, when I got to Lydia Harvey's grave, I knew exactly the point of it all. It just felt like exactly what I had to do.
That sounds like a wonderful way to perhaps wrap up and have an opportunity to mix and mingle, have a beer, have a chat to Julie, and fire out your phones and have a look at the very useful card we have here. You can have it on your Kindle to read at bed tonight, or...
And there's an audiobook.
Oh, go ahead. Okay, so and that's accessible on there too.
Yeah.
Did you read it?
Did I? No.
Oh, it's too bad. Because the swearing would have been excellent.
No, I didn't read it.
But of course, you can also have this very attractive hardcover book depository, secret anti-Amazon site, by the way. It's run out of the UK, and you can get free shipping to Canada. So
Takes a while.
don't support Amazon, support Book Depository. And it's just been a wonderful, let me thank the panelists, Neil and Sonja. Let me thank Julia. Let me thank Isabel and Stefan again for making the technical aspects of this possible, and all of you to come out and share this wonderful event. Good night, everybody. Thank you.